Okay, so I'm going to be reading to you the next chapter from our What is the Declaration of Independence book for our Founders Month. And so the chapter we're going to focus on today is Chapter 2, Taxes and More Taxes. Besides taxing colonists, King George did other things that made the situation in America grow even more tense. In 1761, he ordered a renewal of the rights of assistance, which were a kind of search warrant. British customs officers and soldiers were allowed to search shops, they were allowed to search warehouses, and even people's homes. And this was to make sure that the colonists were only buying things from Great Britain or by the British. If they found any goods that were from other countries, then the shopkeeper or homeowner had to pay a fine to the king. The colonists were furious. It was one thing to search a warehouse or even a shop, but to search people's homes? That was an outrage. James Otis, a lawyer from Massachusetts, went to court. He tried to get the searches stopped, and he is often credited with one of the most important lines in American history. He is the person that said, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." This idea, that is completely wrong to tax people without letting them have a voice in the matter, would become a rallying cry for the American colonists. Here you can see them doing their warehouse checks and store checks. And there's that famous James Otis who said, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." But King George III didn't seem to care what the colonists thought. He needed more and more money. So Great Britain's Parliament passed more and more taxes on the colonists. The Sugar Act of 1764 hit the colonists really hard. It was a tax on all sugar, molasses, wine, rum, and even some lumber and iron. Every home in the colonies used sugar almost every single day. The sugar tax hurt the economy of the colonies. Rum was big business in the colonies, and as it was traded for African slaves. Lumber and iron were important businesses too, and they were heavily taxed now. But Great Britain couldn't care less. It wanted as much money as it could get out of the colonists. So again, those are some of the things that they were taxing, which was a very big problem if you're using sugar every single day to pay more money on it. And there you can see the importance of the trading, the flow of goods. Just so if I can explain here, we can see that coming from Africa to North America, rum, iron, gunpowder, clothes, and tools, they're being traded back and forth. Coming from Africa to Europe is gold and ivory and spices and hardwoods. Coming from Europe is all these manufactured goods that are then coming to the North Americas. And then also coming from Great Britain, we have a back and forth of whale and oil, lumber and furs, rice and silk, tobacco and indigo, sugar, molasses, and wood. So now those goods, which take a while to come, are also being charged at a higher rate thanks to King George. Well, later that same year, Parliament passed the Currency Act. Before this, the American colonies printed their own money. It was used to buy everyday goods. The Currency Act forced Americans to use British money. Here is a British coin from circa 1760s. This completely angered the colonists because their colonial money was now worthless. People in the colonies took to the streets to protest the king and Parliament, but this was only the beginning. Can you believe that it got worse? The Stamp Act then happened of 1765. It was like an explosion in the American colonies. Up until the Stamp Act, Americans mostly paid taxes to Great Britain on items sold to other countries. For example, if a merchant in Pennsylvania sold lumber to a Spanish company, the Pennsylvania company had to pay a great tax to Great Britain on that sale. But any lumber that the Pennsylvania merchant sold to other colony customers, that was not taxed. But with the Stamp Act, colonists now paid a tax on items that they sold to each other in America. For instance, anything that was printed on paper, like newspapers, contracts, wills, or even playing cards, all of them had to have a British stamp, and all of them had to pay a price for that stamp. If a newspaper only cost you 1 pence or 1 penny before the Stamp Act, after the Stamp Act, it would now cost you 2 pence. The Stamp Act affected every single colonist, and all of them hated it. Riots broke out across the colonies, and in Boston, a man named Samuel Adams urged the colonists to fight back. Here is our image of the British stamp. And here is our image of Samuel Adams, one of our founding fathers who we would consider a patriot, who first urged the colonists to fight back. First, they stormed the office of the British Tax Commissioner. The commissioner collected all the tax for Great Britain. Then protesters went to his home. He was so frightened by the crowd around his house that he quit his job the very next day. In New York, 2,000 angry colonists ransacked the house of the British mayor Thomas James. Why were they doing all of this? They were doing all of this because he had boasted that he would ram the stamp tax down the colonists' throats at the point of a sword. Not very nice. It was only after colonists stopped buying British goods and boycotted that the Parliament ended the Stamp Act and the plan backfired. Did that put an end to the trouble, though? No. King George and Parliament just came up with a new tax scheme. It was called the Townshed Axe. These in 1767 acts, they taxed all colonial paint, all oil, and all glass. Oh, and one other thing, tea. And again, people in the colonies rebelled. They protested in the streets, they boycotted, which means they refused to buy British goods. And again, here this image is when they are specifically ransacking the home of Mayor Thomas James. This was hard on many households because only the British sold certain things that most colonial families depended on. It was not easy to give these things up. What colonists minded the most was doing without tea. Tea was their favorite drink in the colonies. Even though it was expensive, most colonists were regular tea drinkers. Boiling water was a common way to purify water. So in every cup of tea, colonists were drinking both clean water and a delicious tasting beverage. Most tea came to America on British ships that had first picked it up in other parts of the world. Now colonists were finding ways to get tea illegally. Some tea was now being shipped in from other countries without the British authorities ever finding out, and some tea was being grown in America, including teas with mint and chicory. The colonists agreed to tough it out and continue to boycott. It was important to make the king and parliament understand that they were fed up with these taxes. Eventually the boycott was a success, or mostly a success. Once again, Great Britain was losing too much money. So, Parliament did away with the taxes on glass and on paper and on sugar in 1770. In fact, they got rid of almost everything in the Townshed Axe. Only one tax was left in place, a tax on tea. Surely the colonists would see how reasonable the king was and that the British government was being reasonable as well. That ends our chapter, but there's one more piece of information that I'd like to share with you, which is I'd like to talk a little bit more about tea in the colonies. So let's talk a little bit more about tea. The tradition of drinking tea actually comes from across the Atlantic Ocean with the first British settlers of the New World. Tea became popular throughout the colonies. Big cities like New York and Philadelphia had many tea gardens where tea was served in the finest of porcelain cups, or sometimes even in silver cups. And even in tiny rural towns, American colonists enjoyed drinking tea. If you drank tea, whether in a fancy garden or at your kitchen table, it was a sign that you were doing well and you were rather sophisticated. So it was a pretty big deal to take away something that made them feel a little wealthier and a little bit more dignified by putting a tax on that, making it cost more money, and making it not easy for everybody to have that luxury. Thank you for watching this chapter. Our next chapter will be Blood in Boston.